Hi, I'm Dr. Virgie Bright Ellington, and today on a very special episode of What Your Doctor Wants You to Know, we're talking about what your doctor wants you to know about human trafficking. And we've got two very special guests that can tell us all about human trafficking, all things human trafficking in terms of how to spot it and most importantly, how to help folks that are in it so we can help eradicate it. Our first guest is Ali Boak. Ali Boak is the director of the Global Center on Human Trafficking, which is located within Montclair State University in New Jersey, a passionate leader in the global movement to end human trafficking for more than 25 years. Ali has worked along survivors of all forms of trafficking to develop innovative, survivor-driven approaches to prevent and address human trafficking across the United States, Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia. As a pioneer in the anti-trafficking movement, Ali co-founded several organizations, networks, and coalitions at the leading edge of the anti-trafficking field today, including the International Organization for Adolescents, or IOFA, Freedom Network USA, the Westchester County Anti-Trafficking Task Force in New York, and the National Human Trafficking and Disabilities Working Group. A recognized expert on the issue of child and adolescent trafficking and exploitation, Ali has provided training, technical assistance, and capacity building support to hundreds of criminal justice, social service, and community organizations in more than 12 countries around the world. So, Ali, first, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for highlighting such an important issue on your show.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you, you're well known and you have a great reputation among folks that work in abolishing human trafficking. So thank you for all you do. Can you tell us the story about how you came to the field of eradicating human trafficking?
Absolutely. So I was in my early 20s and I was a Peace Corps volunteer assigned to the Baltic states, which is Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, right next to Russia. And I was working in a high school teaching English, and I realized that the kids were being trafficked right underneath my nose. And I didn't realize that until I'd come back and I was in grad school in New York, and there was an article on the front page of the New York Times about how young women were being trafficked to Israel and forced into sexual slavery. And in this article, it talked about how the young woman was from Latvia. And I thought, ooh, isn't that strange? I never heard of anything like that. And then like a week later, the Chicago Tribune had an article that said the FBI had uncovered the largest human trafficking ring in the United States. And guess where the human trafficking ring was trafficking to? Latvia. So I'm super nosy. So I decided to go back over to Latvia, and I organized a seminar for doctors, teachers, social workers, anyone who worked with youth. And I basically learned that youth were being trafficked and disappearing, and people thought they were actually going for legitimate jobs, but they were really being duped and forced into sex and labor trafficking. So then I just started IOFA, and from there it just kept going.
And the rest is history, as they say. It blew up from there. So then, Ali, what is human trafficking?
So human trafficking is when one person uses force, right? So that could be hitting someone, kicking someone, physical force, fraud, tricking them, right? Maybe telling them they're going to be doing one thing, but they end up doing something else, or having them sign a contract that isn't what they agreed upon, or coercion. And coercion is often psychological coercion. Like, I know where your family is, and if you don't do what I want, I'm going to hurt your family. Or I have naked pictures of you, and if you don't do what I want, I'm going to spread these all over the internet. So it's force, fraud, or coercion to basically get that person to provide labor or commercial sex. So trafficking, as defined in the United States, there's two forms: labor trafficking and sex trafficking.
So I really appreciate you talking about the differences between the different types of trafficking, of human trafficking. I think many folks think that they know about human trafficking because they think of it as people being tricked into sex work, into being sold as sex slaves. It's really, really important to know that there is labor trafficking that is really, really ubiquitous. And There was an article, I want to say recently, in a national print media, I'm trying to remember where it was, that talked about the human labor trafficking of folks getting tricked into saying that they have jobs for them in the digital world online and doing digital sales, online sales. And what they get tricked into doing is scamming people online, befriending people on social media, and then saying, well, I need this done or that done. I really could use help with this because someone is threatening me, different kinds of stories. But there are many, many, many different types of labor trafficking that, frankly, I don't think I would be aware of if I didn't have like family members who were in law enforcement and doing this kind of work.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people think that trafficking has to involve sex. And that is one of the biggest myths, because there is labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And the International Labor Organization, estimates that there's more labor trafficking in the world than there is sex trafficking. But for some reason, the media prefers to cover sex trafficking. And also, law enforcement is a little bit more set up to investigate cases of sex trafficking because maybe they have vice units, or they're used to prostitution is illegal, so they're used to investigating various sex crimes, where labor trafficking might be more foreign to law enforcement. And it's often a continuum of exploitation. It's not very well understood what labor trafficking is and what is the difference between labor exploitation and actually labor trafficking, right? So when you're being trafficked, you could be paid or you could not be paid. It doesn't matter. It's more about, are you being forced, fraud, or coercion to do this work? And that's another myth, that if someone's paid, it can't be human trafficking. Oftentimes, people that are trafficked are actually paid some money for their work, but they're not free to change their job, or they're not free to control their working conditions. It is quite complex and confusing, but people should know that labor trafficking happens in all industries. I mean, it's particularly prevalent in industries like construction, restaurants, landscaping, domestic work. But I've even worked on cases where engineers have been trafficked, or a dentist was trafficking employees. So it really could be any kind of profession. Another myth too that you touched on is human trafficking also doesn't have to involve movement. I think there's also this myth and misunderstanding that human trafficking happens off in other countries overseas, or that some sort of border, state border, international border has to be crossed. But someone could actually be trafficked in their own hometown, or actually trafficked even in their own house. So there doesn't have to be movement, and it can really happen in anywhere. And it does happen, in all communities across the United States, from large cities to small towns to rural areas to the suburbs. Really, sadly, trafficking is going on all around us. People just aren't aware of it.
How can someone be trafficked in their own home without leaving their home? How can a professional, quote unquote,
That's right,
traffic their employees? Can you tell us about that?
There's also this myth that trafficking is usually done by strangers, but the reality is that usually people are trafficked by someone they know, someone very close to them. So someone could be trafficked in their home, and the two biggest examples that we see of that are when somebody is either working in the home as a housekeeper, live-in housekeeper, or live-in babysitter, or some sort of live-in position, or maybe somebody's living with them because it's like the United Nations, it's a diplomatic situation, right? So diplomats from other countries are allowed to bring staff, and sometimes they have them live with them. So for example, you could have someone that came to the United States to become an au pair and take care of someone's children, but they could be forced to actually perform other work for the family. So for example, I once knew of a case where a nanny was being forced to shovel the driveway. She was forced to do other things that were not in her job description. Her job description was taking care of the children, but they were having them do work for their businesses and things like that, of that nature. And they were threatened that, if you don't do this work, then you're going to be deported. You're going to spend the rest of your life in jail because you're not an American citizen. So they were using these threats, and they defrauded them because they said, you're coming over here to be a nanny and take care of the kids, but then they actually abused them and had them do other forms of work. So that's an example where you could be trafficked in your own home. An example of where you could be trafficked, in the professional office. So a couple of cases come to mind. There was one case where a firm in Georgia was recruiting engineers from India, and they, had a contract of what their position was going to be, what work they were going to be, what they were going to be paid, what they were going to do. And so they had set up like dorm rooms for these engineers to live in because they were all coming from overseas. So the employers were locking them in their dorm rooms at night. They weren't allowing them to go out. They were controlling their movement. They weren't paying them what they were supposed to do. So they had, basically frauded them and then used force to make them work. So that's an example of a highly skilled profession. To be an engineer, you need a lot of education and skills, but where they, were being trafficked.
So does that mean that if I'm a layperson, someone who's not in law enforcement, who is trying to be aware of my surroundings and make sure that, we're all okay, and I am hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's actually folks outside of the states who they're not native folks to the country. They came to the country at any point in their lives as kids or even as adults, recently or long time ago, but they came to the States. They are the folks that are most at risk of being trafficked, meaning a native person or born here in the States, in the United States. Are they at less risk?
That is another myth, that trafficking is just people from overseas, right? Anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, whether you're a U.S. citizen, whether you're, live in the United States, no matter what your immigration status is. Now, there are certain groups of people that are more vulnerable. So, for example, LGBTQ individuals are more vulnerable. People with disabilities are more vulnerable. Youth are more vulnerable. But, it really can happen regardless of your immigration status.
Would you say that's the biggest myth about human trafficking? If you had to pick top 3 biggest myths, Ali, about human trafficking.
There's so many. I guess the top 3 would have to be that it's only an overseas problem, because people don't realize that it's happening in their own communities, in their own backyard, in their own neighbors' homes. I think that's number 1. People need to realize this could be happening right next door to you, literally. I think the second biggest myth is that it always involves sex. And people just think of sex trafficking when so much of the trafficking that happens is labor trafficking. So I want people to really expand their minds and think about trafficking as more comprehensive. And there can be sexual abuse and sexual violence within labor trafficking, but there is labor trafficking as well. And then I would say the third thing is that most traffickers are strangers is the next biggest myth, because traffickers very strategically pick their victims for people who are vulnerable, and they take their time and often groom them. So it's not like the movie Taken, where they're just kidnapped off the street most often. It's more they get to know them in a chat room. And I really want people to know that since COVID, online recruitment and grooming is really increased. There's been several studies that just show that skyrocketing. So what's happening is a lot of people are the traffickers are befriending people online through different dating sites, different chat sites, getting to know them, and then they say, let's meet in person. And then that's where they're nabbed. So that's really important for people to think about the online aspect of human trafficking as well. But a trafficker could be your family member. People with disabilities are sometimes trafficked by their caretakers. I've had cases where traffickers were cousins, uncles, family friends, business owners, diplomats, law enforcement, you name it, they could be a trafficker.
Would you say that people with intellectual disabilities are most vulnerable when you're talking about folks with disabilities? There are certain subpopulations, certain of us tend to be more vulnerable. When you talk about people with disabilities who are especially vulnerable, are you talking about people with intellectual disabilities?
Sadly, there's been very, very little research done on this intersection of human trafficking and disabilities, but we do definitely know that there's been increasing numbers of cases targeting people with all types of disabilities, and not just cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, and even disabilities like ADHD or trauma. Also, we see that people become disabled because of the trafficking, right? So as a result of labor trafficking, not having proper safety equipment, things like that, we see eye injuries, lost limbs, different types of abuse leads to different kinds of disabilities. But we could do a whole radio show just on human trafficking and disabilities, because there's very unique ways that they target people with disabilities, especially people who get like a social security check. So that is another benefit of somebody trafficking someone with disabilities. They often trick them into signing over their check to them. That could be another issue.
Great example. And you also talked about subpopulations that are at higher risk of being vulnerable to being trafficked. And you mentioned youth. And you have someone joining us today who I'm really excited to talk to, who can tell us, from the front lines, tell us their story on how they were tricked and or groomed into getting trafficked as a minor. Can you tell us a little bit about her and her story?
So I'm happy to introduce Treia. So Treia is a survivor of human trafficking and an advocate in the human trafficking field. Treia serves as an advisor to the Westchester County Anti-Trafficking Task Force. She's also done training for the Office of Violence Against Women, which is part of the Department of Justice. And she's also done training in Albany, New York for the Justice Center, New York State Justice Center. Treia is, really helping by sharing her experience so that other youth can know what to avoid, what are the risk factors, and so that adults can know what to look for. Because oftentimes youth that are trafficked are viewed as bad youth, like they're staying out late, they're drinking, or they're doing drugs, or they're new bad friends, and they're viewed as like bad youth. But you have to think about, well, what are they running from, or what are they running to? And with that, I'll really turn it over to Treia.
Hey, Treia, thanks for joining us.
Hi, it's nice to meet you. So yes, like Ali said, I'm an advocate and survivor of human trafficking. I've done training in Albany, Texas. I work for the task force as well, and I'm just so happy to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us, Treia. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, whatever you're comfortable sharing, about how you grew up, your family, your friends, your school life, hobbies?
I'm 22 years old. I grew up in an abusive household, so I was a chronic runaway, and that's how I ended up actually being introduced to my trafficker while running away. I went to school, had good grades. My teachers never noticed a problem. They always thought that, because of the abuse at home, I was running away. I had siblings, I had friends, did normal teen stuff. And then when I get into my late teens, through the abuse, I was not happy. And I started going on online chat rooms, online forums, and that's how I ended up meeting my trafficker in one of these online chat rooms. And he talked to me, told me he was gonna give me a place to stay, give me a place to live, take care of me. And I was needing something like that, like someone to actually care about me. So I ended up going to meet him, and I ended up being trafficked. And you bring up the point of, I was born on U.S. soil. I was born in Bronx, New York. I was raised in New York. I've lived in New York my whole entire life. I still live in New York. So if that gives you the idea that someone that you are talking to right now who was born on U.S. soil could be trafficked on U.S. soil as well. Sorry about the noise in the background.
No apologies needed. Thank you for taking time out to talk with us. I know that you're en route, you're on the road headed to work, so we really appreciate you taking the time. No apologies needed, Treia. So you said something that the teachers knew about the difficulties you were having in your life, the difficulties you were having at home. Are you saying that they were aware of the abuse in the household where you were growing up?
Yes, they were actually. My friends knew, a lot of my teachers knew, but I'm gonna be honest, I'm African American, Black. So for us, abuse is not looked at as abuse. It's looked at as discipline and punishment.
Yes. Thank you for pointing that out, Treia.
Yes. So as an African American young woman, we're getting taught about gentle parenting and being gentle. When our parents grew up, you misbehave, you got popped in the mouth. You could be on school grounds. I've gotten my behind handed to me on school grounds in front of teachers.
Yes.
But it was looked at as discipline, as in, I'm a rowdy child, I'm a bad child, I need to be disciplined, and not as abuse. So in a lot of households, especially now with the older generation, they're not seeing what they're doing as abuse. They're not seeing the hurtful words, the hurtful beatings, the things as abuse. They're seeing it as discipline as justification, as I'm the parent, I know what's right from wrong.
Corporal punishment being used as a form of discipline is used or accepted as an acceptable form of discipline.
And also, this makes us more susceptible to this abuse as we get older, especially with trafficking. You're not going to think, oh, my mom put her hands on me my whole entire life. If somebody else does it, you're not going to really say, oh, I was acting out, I was being bad, I was doing this and that and the third. And it justifies these people's actions. So it makes people more susceptible, especially people from abuse, more susceptible into human trafficking.
What would you say are some of the vulnerabilities that made you at a special risk of being trafficked?
So definitely the abuse that I dealt with. I fall into the LGBTQ, I don't know how to call it. I'm pansexual, I guess. And also, as well, I have something called dyslexia. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but it's a reading disability and writing disability that makes my writing and reading kind of a little bit slower than most people. So growing up, I had an IEP. So that definitely made me more susceptible. The abuse at home, just not feeling like I had anybody in my circle or anybody to talk to about what was going on.
Then IEP, Treia, is something that the state says that you are to have special education services, am I correct, to help you, to support your education through 12th grade. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you think that there were some red flags that people in your life and the school system, your friends, your family, your neighbors should have picked up on that you were being trafficked or at risk of being trafficked? Well, let's just say, you know what? I don't think that we think about that any of those that we know, our neighbors, our loved ones, our friends and family are at risk. In retrospect, what do you think they should have picked up on that you were being trafficked?
I think the isolation, not having a lot of friends, not having a lot of family, definitely being more of a loner type, home situation. Like Ali had brought up before, you could be trafficked out of your own home. And she didn't touch upon it, but I really wish she had. There are parents that willingly traffic their children for money. So, home life. Is this person going out late? Is they staying out late? Are they partying? Are they doing something? Are their parents aware of this? Or are their parents just taking a backseat into their, development? Looking at what's going on at home would have really helped me when I was being trafficked.
Would you say that teachers could have seen in retrospect, if they had been enlightened about red flags, signs of someone being trafficked? Do you think that they would have been able to figure out that you were being trafficked?
Yes, actually I do. And I would love to bring up one of my friends when I was growing up was also trafficked. So I went to school with this one girl and she ended up being trafficked, and me and her had this similar teacher. We're in the same school, and it was just like, wow, me and her had the same exact home life and nobody checked on either one of us, and now look at where we at. And as teachers, I feel like if we get training out, we get people looking, people noticing that yeah, it's a problem, then we could rectify it in the schools. We could see which kids come from troubled home life, which kids are out doing things that they shouldn't be doing to help prevent human trafficking.
What signs should your teachers, with the proper training, have been able, would they have been able to see if they had been trained to identify things? For instance, what things did either you and or your friend who ended up being trafficked also, what was said that your teacher was aware of, where the teacher could have called a number, a hotline, and said, I think you need to look into this person's home life, this child, this minor's home life? What was going on that the public was aware, particularly the school system, would have been aware of, that if they had known that that is a sign of abuse and trafficking, they could have made a phone call and make a change? Can you tell us what were some things? Can you give us some examples, Treia, of some things that were said by you and or your friend who is also a survivor of human trafficking?
Going out late, coming to school late, not doing assignments, abuse at home, maybe welts on the person's body, maybe belt marks, maybe even skin interactions with the parents and the child to see like, okay, maybe this child is being abused at home.
Hey, Treia, the sound went out. The audio went out a little bit. Can you say that again? You said something about identifying welts On the skin?
Well, or bruise, like bruises.
Bruises, welts, signs on the skin of being hit.
As well as, them coming to school constantly late. I realized for both me and my friend, we were constantly coming to school late. We weren't ever at school on time, so that could be a sign of abuse. Seeing the child's interaction with the parents, see if, the parent and home life is okay. So that could be another sign. Seeing if the children has a disability or part of the LGBTQ community, to see if maybe that puts them at risk as well.
And if I might add, running away is a big, big, big red flag. And that's kind of what I alluded to earlier, that kids that run away are labeled bad kids, but they're usually running away from something like physical, sexual, some sort of abuse at home, or they're running to something. Someone's promising them a better life, a better place to live, right? So running away is a major red flag. For teachers and in schools, other signs are, if maybe the kids don't have lunch money, they don't have proper food, or there's a big change in them. They're changing friends. They're changing who they're hanging out with. Maybe they are buying fancy cell phones or Apple Watches and things that they don't really have the money for, because like I mentioned earlier, if someone's being trafficked, sometimes they're not paid, but sometimes they are paid something. Or in the grooming process, the trafficker is giving them gifts and things as a way to lure them in. So those are some other signs that people can be looking for with youth.
So let's say, Ali, that someone is listening to this show or watching this episode. What would you say? Okay, they've got a couple of tips, but what do they do? Teachers, I come from a family of teachers. My mom was a teacher, my sister-in-law, my brother's wife are teachers. All my favorite people are teachers. And I know how overwhelmed they are. They cannot, they're being asked to fix everything with our children. However, the folks that see things, that have contact with children, with minors, who tend to be most vulnerable, let's say that they're not sure, they see changes that they're concerned about, or this is different, this is weird, and I'm concerned. What do they do?
So I think the first thing everyone should do, particularly if you work with youth or you work, with any kind of vulnerable populations, but really everyone should do, is just get yourself educated on human trafficking. And the Global Center on Human Trafficking, we offer twice a semester a free hour-and-a-half Zoom webinar on, we call it Human Trafficking 101, like what you really need to know about it. And the trafficking is offered completely by survivors. They provide the training. And so if you look on our Instagram, Global Center _Human Trafficking, you can follow us on Instagram, and we always advertise our trainings and things on there. You can also sign up for our newsletter, and we can send you all the information. But, traffickers are very dangerous people. So we never, ever want anyone getting involved or confronting the trafficker for your own safety. And think about, you have a trafficker and they view that person as their ownership, right? Their goods and services that they're making money off of. If you start talking to their person, their victim, you could cause more problem and harm for that victim, because they could accuse the victim of telling on them. Victims have their phones checked. They are tightly controlled. And if you approach that victim, you could actually cause more harm. So what we recommend you do is you call the Human Trafficking National Hotline, and they have a tip line, and they are connected to law enforcement all across the country, so they could follow up on your tip. Or I'll also put my cell in here. I'll often get people that will call me and say, particularly professionals, hey, is this trafficking? What do you think this is? We could give you some advice on, every situation so unique, so we could hear what's going on and, tell you some questions to ask if you have a friend. We're really focused right now on human trafficking on college campuses, right? Because kids that are away from home for the first time can be very vulnerable. And at Montclair State, we're a Hispanic serving institution. We have a high percentage of Hispanic, Latina students and first generation, and they're at risk. And so, if you're out there listening and you have a friend that you think might be in this type of situation, you could call the hotline, or you could text me, and we could try to help you, coach you through talking with them if it's in a safe place. But you should never really get involved between a trafficker and a trafficking victim for the reasons that I talked about earlier.
Also making yourself a safe space that even if you don't get involved, you will let that person know, hey, if you need to talk to me, you can always talk to me. You can always I'll let you, I won't say anything. It's just between me and you. So you can always come to me and talk to me and tell me about what's going on and, make it a safe space for them so that they feel like they have somebody outside of their trafficker, especially if their trafficker is making them feel very lonely or making them feel like there's nobody that actually cares about them, making that person feel cared about enough to try to break away.
So Treia, if I'm a teacher or someone who has contact with a person and I'm thinking, you know what, there's something a little bit off about this student, or there's just something that isn't quite right, whether I have a relationship with that person, with that student, to be able to say, hey, you know what, I'm checking in, are you okay? If, things are not okay, please tell me, and I'm going to reassure you that it stays between you and I. If you don't feel comfortable saying that, then the thing to do is, if you're concerned, Ali, is to call the Human Trafficking National Hotline and say, look, I'm concerned about this. I don't know the student very well. That's the move. Never confront the student, of course, and never confront anyone around the student in terms of their family members, friends.
Because you don't know they could be involved with the trafficking. If you talk to the parent may
exactly
be involved with that trafficking. And, the issue is when we're talking about teachers is that, they're mandated reporters, and every state has their own human trafficking laws, which are not consistent. So, for example, New York State, if a mandated reporter calls the child abuse hotline, the case will be screened for human trafficking, because in New York State, we, being DSS, screens every case for human trafficking.
What's DSS, Ali?
Department of Social Services program. They screen whether you're a 3-month-old or, all the way up to 18. However, in some states, they don't have these special programs, and they don't have human trafficking isn't even an allegation of child abuse in their code. So that's why the best thing to do is just call the national hotline, because the states are so inconsistent in their response and who's trained. And I mean, obviously, if someone is in danger, like you're witnessing someone being dragged across the street or dragged by their hair, or, something in emergency, you have to dial 911. Just like you would for any emergency. But I have a story that I tell. It was quite a long time ago now, maybe 15 years, but I was in Brooklyn, and I was in like photocopying kind of store, like where you can make photocopies, ship things. And I overheard this phone conversation, and I thought the person was being trafficked. So I actually called, this was before we had a national hotline. I called 911 and I said, I'm calling to report a case of human trafficking. And they transferred me to the parking department because they thought traffic tickets.
Oh my God.
So again, there's some highly trained law enforcement that really know this stuff, but there's also a lot of law enforcement that don't understand human trafficking. So that's why I really just recommend calling the hotline, because they're all trained, and then they will contact someone in that area that they know is trained as well.
So Treia, along your journey, what were some of the programs and services that were most helpful to you or important to you, do you think, in terms of rescuing you, in terms of getting you out of the criminal behavior that was being done to you?
So Ali has been a great support and a great system and a great help to me through my journey as a survivor, as well as a program called the Safe Harbor Program. They got me involved with therapy, so deal with what happened to me. They got me in support with some great classes, with life skill classes, with employment. So definitely in between Ali and the Safe Harbor Program, it really helped me, deal with what actually happened. And also, I would say FPAP, which is called the Family Court Assistant Program. It's run through Children's Village. I had some great mentors there that I got to talk to that helped me. And after I was found, they were the people who I initially told what happened to, and they were the ones who said, this doesn't sound right. We're going to call the FBI, and as well as the FBI, Karma Bruce, two people who really helped me, really sat down and talked to me, really told me that it was okay. I was always told that FBI people are scary, that they're mean, that they don't really care. Because again, the way I was raised is that if you're assaulted, you're raped, you're abused, nobody cares. So having people that actually sat there and said they cared and they want to help and did help really helped me.
Treia, who came to you and said, wow, what's happening to you and what you just shared with me is wrong? And said, not only is it wrong, but we need to get you out. We need to help you escape. Tell us that story. How did that happen? Who and what happened?
For me, I actually left my trafficker of my own accord. After about a week with him, I was scared, I was shaken, I was abused, I was beaten. And I begged him to let me go. And he said, all right, but you have to come back. So he let me go. And I actually went back home and I ended up talking to my aunt for a little while. And she ended up, because I was a runaway at that point. And that's the problem. Everybody assumes that if you run away, nothing happened to you. You're just a runaway. And I got taken to FCAP, which is what happens when you're a youth in Westchester and you're dealing with family court and you're a runaway. And the people at FCAP was the one who actually said, this sounds like a really big problem, something that we've never dealt with before. We're going to contact the proper authorities. So it was that after I got into a program already, that actually was the one who put me with the police to find out that I was actually being trafficked. Because I didn't know I was being trafficked at that point. I was 16. I was like, what happened to me happened to me. It's nothing serious. And they sat me down and was like, no, this sounds really serious. This sounds like something more than what you're just telling us. This sounds like trafficking. So it was definitely the Family Court Assistance Program. If I'm correct, I can't remember his name right now because it was so long ago, but it was one of the staff members there. Mr. Bostic, that's his name. His name was Mr. Bostic. He was a very tall dude. He looked like Snoop Dogg. And I had been there before, and he had remembered me.
Treia, we got the most important part, which is you shared some of the programs and services that were most helpful and important to you to help you escape. So, Ali, if you can tell us a little bit more, at the end of the day, like Treia said, she shared with us what she wants everyone to know about human trafficking and how us everyday folks who are not in law enforcement can help people who are being trafficked. Can you tell us a little bit more about Treia shared, hey, this is what you can do to help people who you're concerned there are horrible things happening to them. This is what you can do to stop and listen and help them escape. What do you say, Ali? I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you want everyone to know about human trafficking and how us everyday folks who are not in, when I mean lay people, everyday folks, non-law enforcement can help?
I have never met a survivor of trafficking that said, I'm a victim of human trafficking. So most victims of human trafficking, survivors of human trafficking, don't know they're being trafficked. So they will never just say, hey, I'm being trafficked. They will talk about maybe how they're being abused, how they're not being paid, maybe how they're being treated, right? What's happening. And oftentimes a person mistakenly thinks that they deserve it because they agreed. So maybe they were in a desperate situation. And so they agreed, especially with minors, because minors cannot agree to be sex trafficked, right? So they're, because of their special age, they're a protected class under the age of 18, right? By human rights instruments. If you have somebody who's 15, 16, 17, and they've run away or they're in a tough spot and they, somebody offers them a ride or a place to stay or food in exchange for sex, that is human trafficking. You're getting commercial sex out of them and in exchange for something of value. It doesn't just have to be money. Yes. Right? But it's considered paying them if you're paying them in housing or paying them with food or paying them with other things. So if you do talk to someone, remember that the best thing would be to get them to someone trained on the issue. But you could certainly encourage them to get help, right? And they can call the Human Trafficking Hotline themselves as a survivor and get a referral on where to go for help. Because it's such a complex issue in law that we can't advise them what to do, really, unless you're a trained professional, on this crime. So you can be helpful by listening, by being a safe space, by being a friend to someone, but you really need to try to get them to help, try to get them with somebody who knows human trafficking, either a service provider, a social worker, or a law enforcement professional that really understands this crime and can help them because they are in a very dangerous situation. And I've worked with survivors that have been trafficked for days, months, years, decades. So it really, when they talk with you, it's really important to try to get them connected to someone because it may be their only chance, their only time that they actually feel that they can tell someone about what's going on with them. So you have to take it very seriously. And I always say, you don't need to be 100% sure they're being trafficked, like it's complex to identify someone. But if that might be their only time that they reach out, wouldn't it be better to refer them and find out maybe it's not trafficking, maybe something else is going on? But if you didn't refer them, then they maybe never get out of the situation. So I always train people, do something, even if you're not 100% sure. And that's why I encourage people to come to our training, because in our training, we talk about a lot of case examples. And so what I always say is, listen, if you see something that sounds like those types of cases that you learned about in the training, then you make a call. You don't need to have all the elements. You don't need to go through a checklist. You just make a call, because the professionals will figure out what's going on.
Like Treia said, you don't have to be a professional. If you're just not sure, well, something is just not right, or this makes me feel uncomfortable. I just don't like the way my friend or my student is being treated. Just call the Human Trafficking National Hotline, 1-888-373-7888, or text help or info. I'll post this if you're watching on YouTube on Ask a Doctor or Dr. Virgie, that'll be below the screen here, and we'll also post it on the voiceamerica.com site. Thank you so much, Ali and Treia, for sharing your stories. This is you're going to save lives. These stories, and saying, you know what, this is what's really happening. This is what it really looks like. And even if you're not sure what it looks like, you're not sure that you recognize it, you're saying, you know what, something doesn't feel right. Listen to your gut, and just pick up the phone and just say, I'd rather be wrong and have someone investigate than just totally miss the opportunity to save someone's life. So thank you, ladies, so very much. And Ali, there's just so much to cover here. I'm going to have you come back.
Well, I'd be more than happy to. And thank you. It's really important for everyone to hear this information. So I'm so glad that you brought us on, and hopefully this will reach somebody and help somebody.
Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate getting to tell my story, getting able to let people know this really happened, and eventually save somebody's life and make sure that, this doesn't happen in the future. The whole point of the Global Center of Human Trafficking is so that we could eliminate human trafficking altogether. And if my little voice could do it and help somebody else, I'd be glad to.
Thank you so much, Treia. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much. You take good care, Treia.
You too.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.